university, what happens then? Because I know at some point you worked for Acorn, which is something I wanted to
Yeah, well, at university, during the summer holidays I had to go back to Leyland to work, and I worked on some quite interesting projects there. But in the other holidays, I first of all worked for Science of Cambridge, which is it was Chris Curry and Clive Sinclair who started this company, and I did end user support. There were some funny stories there, like people would send back the computer because it was a kit, and they'd build the kit and it didn't work, and you'd get a kit back and say, why hasn't it worked? And the answer was, well, I wasn't allowed to use a soldering iron, so I glued it together instead, and you get all these components glued on the circuit board and things like that. It was really funny. So that was customer support, and then I wrote some user guides for the next time. I wrote some user guides for one of the Sinclair computers, I think the ZX80 or something. And then when I came back, Acorn was just starting up with Herman Hauser and Chris Curry. So I then started working with them, and they knew I was writing an operating system, a filing system that worked with cassette drives. And so I implemented that for an Acorn computer, which then ultimately turned into the BBC Micro.
What was Herman Hauser like at that time? Because we see him as this almost deified figure in Cambridge at the moment. What was he like back then? That would be interesting to know.
I think equally deified. He was a very well-respected person, very switched on, and quite a good gift for seeing what was coming. And he always used to look after the people who worked for him as well. So I remember we used to get taken out to Angeline's restaurant and have these nice lunches and things like that. So it was a good place to work, very good place to work.
So how long were you there for?
I was just there in holidays, so I was never there officially. And when I left university, I had a choice. I had a number of job offers, one of which was a job offer to go and work for Acorn, one of which was a job offer to go and work for the Liverpool Software Gazette, funnily enough.
You remembered
Leyland. They remember, well, that's right, because they became a company called Micro Digital, which was a big computer supplier. But funnily enough, I took up an offer from GEC Computers in Dunstable. And the reason for that was, while I was at Leyland, I'd written some software that they desperately wanted to take forward. It was a piece of database software. And so they paid considerably over the going rate to get me, because they wanted me to take this software I'd built at Leyland and sort of rebuild it for them. Yeah, get me to regenerate it. But when I got there, they then got me to write a Fortran compiler for a year. And so I stayed there for a year and then moved to Cambridge.
So coming back to Torch in Cambridge, was there a totally different atmosphere?
It was very different. So at GEC, I didn't really know what the company was about and the marketing angle and why they got their business. But when I came back to Cambridge, it was quite obvious what was going on. We were going to build this really good product that people would buy. And so I was brought in to make this product come about. And when we launched Torch, when we started Torch, I was brought in as the software person to build this software system, because Acorn was going to be providing hardware. And when Herman negotiated the deal with the BBC said, we need a business version of the BBC Micro. So Herman was quite smart. He said, instead of Acorn building a business micro, we've created a separate company to dedicate themselves to building a business micro, which will be called the Torch computer. And Acorn took a 20% stake in the business, and we just started off. So we were going to use Acorn hardware, build a layer of business software on top, and then there'd be a business version of the BBC Micro. So that was the idea. About 3 or 4 months, it became apparent that Acorn wasn't going to deliver us the hardware. So what we had to do was, oh, well, we've got this software we're writing, there's no hardware to run it, so we can't sell any computers. So the then CEO at the time, who was a guy called Peter Harris, was quite bold. He said, okay, well, how hard will it be to make our own hardware? So I said, well, I'll have to bring a guy along who'll know about that. So we effectively brought in Martin Jackson, who's a sort of person from university who's a real hardware genius. And he started building a clone of not a clone, a different implementation of what Acorn was going to build. And we got that built in about 6 weeks, whereas in the end, Acorn was about 2 years late. And so we just brought this product to market. And as a result, we then effectively bought out Acorn's share of the company. We were still using the BBC microcomputer board, but we had our own main processor we built ourselves. So we became more of a hardware software company. So at that stage, I became the technical director. And a few years later, I then became the CEO.
One of the things that Torch did eventually was, sell their software to Steve Jobs, who'd been booted out of Apple and was going to start next. So how did that happen?
Anyway, so the Steve Jobs story is that we were demonstrating this computer at a conference in Los Angeles, and that must have been about 96-ish. And Geico showed up and said, "Oh, Steve must see this." Really? What must he see? Must see this interface. So I got dragged up to see this Steve, who was up in Deer Creek Road in, I think it must have been Palo Alto or something. Jumped on a plane. I vaguely knew about him. I knew Steve Jobs, but I didn't.
Celebrity that he'd had
Correct.
now at all.
Yeah, and he wasn't in the Unix world, which I was in, and I didn't really think much of Apple. But on the other hand, and I think it was sort of, and Macintosh was around, which was quite a profound influence on me. I showed it to Steve Jobs. Cut long story short, he was there. He didn't like the fact it was color because he was very convinced that black and white was the way he wanted it, because he was starting a new company called Next, and he needed some software to feed into the Next development effort. And so we sold him this software for hundreds of thousands of dollars, plus a letter saying it was the insanely great software, or whatever Steve Jobs would say. So we got a letter saying Steve Jobs thought it was the greatest thing, and a check.